The scream came first sharp, cracked, and furious enough to slice through the noise of the production floor. I had barely reached the exit when Marcus Rowan's voice thundered out of his office, a sound that made every pair of hands at Northline Precision Outsourcing freeze mid-motion. 10 minutes earlier, I had been standing in front of his desk. "Vivian?" "What now?" he said without looking up, tapping the side of his monitor as if I were one more technical glitch he didn't have time for. "This is the last thing," I answered. My voice was steady. It surprised even me. I set my badge down. Then the company laptop. And finally the folded note, just a small square of paper, nothing dramatic except for what was written inside. Marcus flicked it open with the same impatience he used on every detail he thought he could ignore. "Read it," I said quietly. He smirked at the tone, but he did as I asked. For a moment, he didn't react. Then his eyebrows pinched together, his jaw stiffened, and the smirk vanished. "Go find something interesting in your spam folder." That was all the note said. 7 words. Nothing more. When I stepped out of his office and began crossing the long aisle between the machining stations, the room felt strangely light. Like the moment before a storm finally breaks, I kept walking. I did not hurry. I did not turn back. I was halfway to the time clock when the storm finally hit. "Vivian Hale," Marcus roared. "What the hell is this? Why is this in my spam chairs scraped?" Conversations died. I heard someone from Human Resources gasp, then rush toward his door. Another supervisor muttered. What did she do? I did not answer. I kept my pace even as adrenaline pulled at my ribs. They would soon discover the email he buried in filters he should never have created. The resignation he ignored for 4 long weeks, and every document he hoped I had not saved. By the time the next shift arrived, nothing at Northline would look the same again, and neither would I. 4 weeks before the scream, I stood in Marcus Rowan's doorway, holding a single sheet of paper, my resignation, printed, signed, and folded with the precision I used on every engineering report I had ever submitted. "Marcus, do you have a moment?" I asked. He glanced at the page in my hand and let out a breathy laugh. "That looks serious. Planning to complain about the overtime again. It's my resignation," I said, "effective in 2 weeks. His smile widened as if I were telling a joke at a party he hadn't wanted to attend. I placed the letter directly into his palm. He didn't bother breaking eye contact long enough to read it. Instead, he slid it under a stack of vendor bids and tapped the pile with one finger. "This happens all the time," he said. "People get emotional, then they cool off. You'll calm down." "I'm not emotional," I replied. "I'm leaving." He waved his hand toward the door. "Go handle the tooling report, Vivian. We can revisit this when you're in a better headspace." Something in my chest tightened, but I walked back to my station without another word. By lunch, nothing had changed. By the end of the day, nothing had changed. The next morning, I went straight to Human Resources. Diane, who handled most internal files, skimmed her screen and frowned. "There's no resignation on record from you, Vivian. Are you sure you gave it to him?" I handed it directly to Marcus. She lowered her voice. "Then it is his responsibility to submit it, without his request tied to it. I cannot input anything." A few hours later, while I was inspecting a rejected tooling batch, a coworker murmured as he passed, "Marcus says you're not actually quitting. Says people do this for attention." I stared at him until he looked away. The words didn't sting. They sank heavy, cold, final. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with my resignation draft open on my computer again, I understood something I had never let myself admit. My decision to leave had been dismissed before it was even acknowledged. My exit had been rewritten by someone who thought he owned the ending, and the only way out suddenly felt like a door someone else kept slamming shut. The first week after handing Marcus my resignation, nothing happened. No email, no meeting, no acknowledgement. When I approached his desk on Friday, he didn't even look up. "Marcus, did you have a chance to review?" He cut me off with a chuckle. "Vivian, relax. You're going through a phase. I'm not processing anything until you cool down." "I wasn't asking for your permission," I said. He finally met my eyes, amused in a way that made my skin crawl. "Then why are you standing here?" I walked away before the heat in my face could betray me. By the second week, he had assigned me to cover overtime on the failing CNC automation line. The system jammed every few hours, overworked and under-maintained. I spent 2 nights resetting sensors and rebuilding a spindle assembly, logging every step so the night shift would not be left guessing. On Monday morning, the plant director stopped by during a meeting, who stabilized the automation line. Production reports looked clean this weekend. Before I could open my mouth, Marcus put a hand on the shoulder of a junior engineer. Ethan handled it. Kid's sharp. Ethan's eyes widened. Actually, Vivian. Marcus tightened his grip. Team effort, he said brightly. Everyone plays a part. I kept my hands folded under the table so no one would see them shake. At the end of the 3rd week, I returned to human resources. Diane pulled up my profile, eyes narrowing at the empty status line. Marcus still hasn't submitted a request. Without his initiation, there's nothing I can do. I stared at her. You mean I'm trapped here because he refuses to acknowledge my resignation? She lowered her voice. I am sorry. He controls this process. Back at my workstation, the noise of the plant seemed to swallow me whole. My workload hadn't shrunk. My responsibilities hadn't shifted. The only thing that changed was my visibility, now reduced to whatever Marcus decided suited him. The silence around my resignation was no longer an oversight. It had become the loudest insult he could give. The moment that finally snapped something in me came at the end of a long Thursday shift. I had stepped into the hallway outside the calibration room to catch my breath when I heard Marcus's voice carrying from the open door of the supervisor office. He was speaking to Dan, one of the senior floor leads. Vivian is not leaving, Marcus said with absolute certainty. Trust me, she needs this job more than we need her. Dan hesitated. She handed you a resignation, didn't she? Marcus laughed softly, the same dismissive sound he used whenever he wanted to feel bigger. People hand me those all the time. They come back. They always do. She will too. I stayed frozen against the wall, my back pressed to the cool metal paneling. Something inside me shifted quiet. Cold. Unmistakable. Whatever was left of my patience drained away in one clear line. Marcus was not ignoring my resignation, he was erasing it. That night, at home, I opened my laptop and pulled up the first email I had sent him that week. Unanswered. I scrolled through the second. Also unanswered. I began saving everything, every ignored message, every task assigned verbally, so he could deny it later. Every time-stamped repair I had completed on my own. I opened a new folder labeled 4 weeks and filled it with documentation, photos of equipment failures I had reported, notes from meetings where he had dismissed safety concern, screenshots of weekend overtime assignments he forgot to record. The more I organized, the calmer I became. Not peaceful, focused, precise. Around midnight, I sat back and whispered into the empty room, if he wants to pretend nothing happened, then the record will tell the truth for me. I closed the laptop gently. Nothing about this retaliation would be noisy. Nothing would be reckless. He had counted on my silence. He had counted on my exhaustion. He had forgotten I was an engineer. I did not shout. I documented. And eventually, the person he underestimated would be the one holding every record he thought he buried. By the start of the 4th week, I stopped expecting Marcus to acknowledge anything I said out loud. He had built a world where my words only mattered if they served him. So I turned to the one thing he could not twist: written record. Late one night, I sat at my kitchen table and opened a blank email addressed to him. Marcus, this is my formal resignation. I typed the words slowly, letting each sentence settle. I listed my effective final date. I outlined every system and project currently under my responsibility. I attached a summary of the tasks I had completed in the past month. I included a scan of the resignation letter I had placed in his hand, and at the bottom, I added a timeline of the 4 weeks of follow-ups he never answered. My cursor blinked at me like a metronome. The email was professional and complete, precisely what HR would expect. But something still felt off. Marcus had ignored my physical letter. He had ignored every verbal request. I needed to make sure this message reached him on his terms, in the exact place he assumed he had total control. A memory surfaced. Months ago during a training session, he had bragged to a group of us. I set up filters to auto-dump repetitive messages. Anything with the words notice, policy, or documentation goes straight to my spam. Saves me hours every week. He thought it was clever. It was reckless. I scrolled to the subject line and typed, Notice process documentation review attached. He would never open it voluntarily. But one day, someone would force him to. I read the email one final time, inhaled, and pressed send. The faint whoosh from my laptop felt almost anticlimactic. Nothing exploded, no alarms sounded. The room stayed still. I closed the laptop gently, knowing the truth was now out of my hands and buried in a folder Marcus believed he never needed to check. Marcus acted as if the last 4 weeks had never happened. On Friday afternoon, he strolled up to my station, tapping a clipboard against his palm. "I need you on supplier quality tests this weekend," he said. "No one else understands the parameters the way you do." "I already submitted my resignation," I reminded him. He shrugged. "And I already told you we are not processing it. Saturday at 6 in the morning, do not be late." I wrote nothing down. I simply nodded and went back to work. That weekend, I ran every test he assigned. Not for him, never again for him, but for the record. I photographed start times, logged each inspection, captured calibration readings. By the time I left on Sunday afternoon, I had a full ledger of hours that Marcus would later pretend had never existed. On Monday morning, I began quietly dismantling the traces of myself at Northline. I wiped down my workstation, removed the photo of my sister from the inside of my locker, carried home the notebook I never let out of my sight. In the break room, I printed the last 3 months of pay stubs and highlighted inconsistencies Marcus once insisted were rounding errors. At my desk, I reread sections of Washington Labor Code about ignored resignations and employer retaliation. Every line steadied me further. Before leaving that night, I forwarded a copy of the resignation email to a private folder, not to expose him yet, but to protect the truth if he tried to bury it again. On Tuesday, and while I was verifying a shipment of machined housings, a coworker, Lena, stepped close and whispered, "Vivian, are you leaving for real?" I slipped another label onto a finished piece and kept my voice light. "You will find out the same day he does." Her eyes widened, but she said nothing else. The air around me changed after that. People sensed something coming, something slow and deliberate. I no longer asked for permission to go. I simply prepared for the moment when I would. I arrived before sunrise, long before anyone else stepped onto the production floor. The quiet helped. I finished the last batch of reports Marcus had assigned me, closed out every open ticket, and cleared my computer of personal files. There was nothing left anyone could claim I had abandoned. By mid-morning, I packed a small box with the handful of belongings still at my workstation. A pen I liked, a half-used notebook, the stainless steel caliper Marcus once said was too delicate for someone like me. I placed my badge on top and shut the box. Around noon, Marcus strutted past my desk with the confidence of someone who believed he still owned the storyline. "So," he said, slowing to a stop, ready to get over this little tantrum. I did not turn toward him. "I told you 4 weeks ago I was leaving. That is not how this works. Vivian?" His tone was all condescension, no doubt. "Employees do not decide when the company is done with them. Management does." I folded another report and placed it neatly in the completed stack. I let the silence answer him, because giving him words felt like charity. He scoffed and walked away, muttering something to another supervisor about engineers with attitudes. At precisely 4 in the afternoon, I picked up my box and walked to his office. He looked up, surprised, as if he had forgotten I existed until that moment. "What is this?" he asked. "My last day," I said. I set the laptop, badge, and folded paper on his desk. He flicked the note open with lazy impatience, the moment his eyes reached the line I had written. Something in his posture snapped tight. "Go find something interesting in your spam folder." His jaw locked. His hand stopped midair. For the first time since I had known him, he looked unsure. Arrogance had met the truth, and the truth was finally standing in front of him. I walked out of Marcus's office without waiting for a reaction. The note had landed. The truth was planted. Whatever came next was no longer my responsibility. I had taken 10 steps toward the exit when it began. A single roar, sharp enough to slice through the clatter of metal crates and humming machinery, burst from behind the glass wall of his office. Conversation stopped mid-word. A wrench clattered to the ground. Then another shout followed, louder, ragged with disbelief. "Why is this in spam?" Marcus bellowed. Why did no one tell me? Employees turned instinctively toward the noise. Through the office window, his arms flailed as he grabbed at a stack of papers, sending half of them skidding to the floor. His monitor glowed with the open email, the one he had buried 4 weeks earlier under a filter he should never have created. Diane from Human Resources rushed in first. "Marcus. What is going on?" He jabbed a shaking finger at the screen. "Her resignation. Weeks ago, all this, look at all this, why was it hidden?" I heard Diane inhale sharply, even from across the floor. Her voice tightened. "That email is time-stamped. And these attachments. Marcus, there are overtime logs here, safety reports, follow-up attempts. It should not have gone to spam," he shouted. "You set your own filters," she said quietly. "Anything labeled notice or documentation would have been redirected automatically. You told the supervisors that in training last quarter." A second supervisor stepped in, eyes widening at the monitor. "Is that a screenshot?" "Showing you created the rule," Marcus froze. "That is not, she set this up. No one can access your filters but you," Diane said. He looked from one face to another, searching for someone to blame, but every corner of the room held a reflection of the same truth. He had buried the evidence himself. Inside his inbox, everything he had ignored now glared back at him: unpaid hours, dismissed safety concerns, a resignation he refused to process. The plant floor had fallen silent by the time he shouted again, voice cracking under the weight of his own choices. And the consequences he had tried to hide finally found him. Corporate arrived from Portland 2 days after Marcus's outburst. Their presence moved through the plant like a cold front, quiet, sharp, unavoidable. An audit team set up in a conference room and began pulling files, interviewing supervisors, and reviewing Marcus's digital history. No one pretended it was routine. The first supervisor summoned returned pale. "They have his email rules," he whispered to a cluster of operators, "all of them, by the afternoon." I was called in. A woman in a navy blazer introduced herself as Karen from compliance. "Ms. Hale, we need your statement regarding the email you sent and the documentation you attached." I sat across from her and folded my hands. "What would you like to know?" She clicked her pen. "We have evidence showing Mr. Rowan created filters that redirected messages containing the words notice, policy, or documentation into his spam folder. We also have internal metrics indicating that safety reports were suppressed. We need to understand your role in what happened." "My role was trying to resign," I said. "Everything you see in that folder was work I performed, concerns I raised, or hours I logged." He refused to acknowledge any of it. Karen reviewed a page in her binder. "He reassigned credit for several of your repair tasks to junior staff. Do you confirm that?" "Yes." "And he verbally informed Human Resources not to process your resignation." "That is correct." She nodded once. "Please submit all records you kept." I placed a flash drive on the table. "Everything is here, time-stamped and unedited." For the first time, Karen's expression softened. "Thank you. This clarifies a great deal." 2 weeks later, an email from headquarters went out to the entire company. Marcus Rowan was terminated for cause. Several supervisors received written disciplinary notices for participating in or ignoring policy violations. Human Resources leadership was ordered into mandatory compliance training, and a new company-wide protocol for resignations and documentation was implemented, effective immediately. When I finished reading the announcement, I sat back in silence. One person's misconduct had cracked open an entire system, and the shift inside Northline had only just begun. My first morning at the new consultancy in Tacoma felt almost unreal. The office was smaller, quieter, the kind of place where people greeted one another because they wanted to, not because a supervisor hovered nearby. I met my new manager, a woman named Elise, in a sunlit hallway lined with project sketches. "Vivian Hale," she said, offering her hand. "Welcome aboard." I shook it, still adjusting to the unfamiliar warmth in her tone. "Thank you, I am glad to be here." She nodded toward a small conference room. "Before we start onboarding, I want you to know something. We read your email, all of them, and we are glad you chose us." The words caught me off guard, not suspicious, not hesitant, just grateful. I felt something loosen inside me, a knot I had carried for months. By the end of my second week, I had met every engineer on the team. No one dismissed my questions. No one belittled my reports. When I presented a design adjustment to a supplier client, Elise leaned back in her chair and said, "Good catch, Vivian. That is the kind of detail work we value." I had forgotten what it felt like to be heard. Near the end of the month, an email from a colleague at Northline reached my personal inbox. Thought you should see this. Attached was a bulletin from the Regional Manufacturing Consortium. It listed disciplinary actions across several companies, under Marcus Rowan's name. The line was brief but unmistakable. Temporary prohibition from management positions due to compliance misconduct. I read it twice, not out of satisfaction, but out of a quiet acknowledgement that the ripple of truth had traveled farther than I expected. He would not be able to repeat what he had done, not for now. That evening, I walked along the Seattle waterfront before heading home. The air smelled of salt and distant rain. My steps felt lighter than they had in years. I had not won by watching someone fall. I had won by walking away from a place that never deserved to keep me and by choosing a beginning that finally did.